Will the United States ban TikTok? A bill's passed that could make the Chinese platform unavailable in the country. The reason given, TikTok is a national security threat. But what about freedom of speech, and how will Beijing respond? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm James Bays. The future of TikTok is at risk in the United States, with a possible bill passing its first stage with a landslide vote in the House of Representatives. The popular video-sharing app is used by millions of Americans every day, and it's owned by a Chinese company. Republicans and Democrats say there's nothing stopping China from using its data to alter algorithms and influence voters in an election year. Critics say that's nonsense and a clear violation of freedom of speech. If the bill is passed by the Senate, President Joe Biden says he'll sign it into law, but that vote could stall, especially as legal challenges are likely to follow. Under the bill, the company must sell its assets, but to whom and under what conditions? We'll explore all of these issues with our guests in a moment, but first this report by Katia Lopez-Horoyan.
The rules are suspended, the bill is passed.
A bipartisan vote that could ban TikTok in the United States. Democrats and Republicans alike say the popular video-sharing app owned by a Chinese company poses a threat to national security.
First, TikTok said its data is not accessible to China-based ByteDance employees. False. China-based employees routinely access this data, even unbeknownst to employees of TikTok USA.
Tell Congress to not ban TikTok.
More than 170 million Americans use TikTok. Supporters of the ban say data collected by the app could be used by China's government to manipulate algorithms. And that, they fear, could ultimately sway voters, particularly ahead of the U.S. election in November. Under the bill, the company would have about 6 months to divest its U.S. assets or face a ban.
If Saudi Arabia buys it, is that fine? Are we not concerned about the national security concerns in that situation? So I just think it's an important issue. It deserves to be addressed, but I think it should be addressed with more input and more thoughtful deliberation.
President Joe Biden also says TikTok could be a national security risk.
If they pass it, I'll sign it.
But in an election year, supporting a ban on TikTok could hurt Biden in the polls, especially among young voters. TikTok's CEO is urging users to lobby their representatives in Washington.
We believe we can overcome this together. I encourage you to keep sharing your stories. Share them with your friends. Share them with your family. Share them with your senators. Protect your constitutional rights. Make your voices heard.
Business owners whose livelihoods depend on TikTok say a ban would put them out of business. Critics, including China, say the bill reflects a double standard, especially when it comes to freedom of speech in the U.S.
It's the logic of a bandit. The U.S.'s handling of TikTok will let the world see more clearly whether the United States' so-called competition-based rules are actually beneficial to the world or if they're only self-serving.
The bill will now head to the Senate for a vote, but analysts say even if it passes, it will likely face a set of legal challenges. Katia Lopez-Horoyan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
We've got a fascinating range of perspectives from our guests today. In Wilmington, North Carolina, Professor Sarah Krebs is founder and director of the Technology Policy Institute at Cornell University and the author of the book Social Media and International Relations. In Fort Lauderdale, Don Horan was acting Executive Deputy Chief Information Officer for New York when it banned TikTok on state-issued phones used by executive agency employees. And in London, Chung, Ching, Kwong is a senior analyst with the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China. It's a global network of legislators focusing on China policy. Ching is herself a Hong Kong dissident living in exile. Great to have you all on the programme. Well, we all know, or at least know about TikTok. It's the most downloaded app in the world. Mostly, I think people know it for lip-sync videos, silly videos, people dancing. Don, how important, how influential is this app?
It's extremely influential. You know, if you look at the history of it and how often people actually use the app and then go and do things like purchase things just because the app tells them to, it shows you that it has great control over people's motivations and what they choose to do in their own personal lives. So it's hugely influential.
And in terms of recent elections, Sarah, I hear that in Indonesia, TikTok played a big part, and also in Pakistan, where we saw Imran Khan, the former prime minister, who's in jail. His supporters, I believe, use TikTok a great deal.
Yeah, I think politically, candidates, leaders go to where the action is. And if this is where people are spending time, that's where they're going to go. Just like President Joe Biden in the United States, he says he supports a ban, and then his campaign turned to TikTok to produce its ads. So it's a very interesting kind of two-sided story here.
And Sarah, staying with you for a moment, in terms of TikTok and exactly who owns TikTok, I worked that out. That's ByteDance, headquartered in China. Mm-hmm. But then when I got to who owns ByteDance, it gets a lot murkier, doesn't it?
It sure does. And I think that's part of the concern, is that it's murky, it's unclear, but I don't think that ByteDance would dispute that it is Chinese-based, and there are security laws in China that would require ByteDance to turn over data if the government asked. And I think that's at the root of the national security concern that Congress is trying to tackle here.
OK. Ching, I would like to get your perspective on this, and I'd like to start with your very interesting background, because you are a campaigner for freedom of speech, but you're also an activist who was in Hong Kong and who fled to Europe. So where do you stand with this bill? Do you agree that it's a good thing that Congress, well, that the House of Representatives have passed this and then the US may be taking action? What's your view on it?
I do think it's a really good initiative to try to protect users' data to not fall into the wrong hands, especially for people like me and many other Hong Kongers who are now residing in the US, and also the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, the Chinese dissidents that is in the country. Because a lot of our data is being collected by the app. It collects what I copy and paste on my clipboard. It has access to my photo albums. It has access to my location data, my phones, like specific serial code numbers and so on. So it has a lot of information about the users, of people around its users. And as a dissident myself, simply speaking from a personal point of view, I feel very scared if I know that my data could possibly fall into the wrong hands, not because I'm a user, but because some people I know are users and that they share more than necessary information with the app, and then it gets transferred to ByteDance, and then from there it can be accessed, as Sarah said, by the Chinese government. And even though TikTok said it doesn't happen, it does, but maybe not through TikTok, but through its transfer to ByteDance and then to China. And there's also no transparency because the security laws in China would require ByteDance to lie about it. So I'm personally quite supportive of the bill because of like my background and also my passion for data protection and digital rights.
Isn't there, though, a contradiction here? Because one of the things you were protesting about in Hong Kong was the lack of free speech and lack of freedom of expression, which China was cracking down on. Some will say the US is now doing exactly the same.
But the bill itself does not necessarily say, hey, let's now completely eradicate TikTok from the market in the US, but it's saying because of national security risks, the company will have to divest and like be sold from its parent company ByteDance to continue to operate in the US. And therefore, if it doesn't, then it might be banned in the US. It's not a de facto ban and said TikTok has to get out of the US. It's not like that. And I can see the merit of this approach is not completely banning a platform, which is definitely problematic. I think technology should be neutral. But how do you deal with the data protection, the privacy, the mass surveillance, the mass data collection, and the possible risk to the democratic process, as we have seen in Canada and even back in 2016, the US about the Cambridge Analytica? Like, how do we balance all that? So I do see this bill being a quite advanced approach in trying to protect all those values, but not completely asking TikTok to completely to be disbanded in the US. It still allow TikTok to operate, but just in very different settings. But I do see the concern of free speech for sure.
Sarah, do you agree with that? This is not a ban. I mean, there are 170 million, maybe, Americans, I think, that was TikTok's own figure, who use this app every single month.
Right. I think one of the ways that the current bill is trying to get around these constitutional concerns that were raised in 2023, but also in 2020 when President Trump tried to ban TikTok, is that it has moved away from the language of banning the platform and instead framing it as a choice that China will have to divest of, or ByteDance will have to divest of TikTok, or then if it chooses not to do that, then there will be a ban on the platform. But it also, in this last year, I think what has made this bill much more inoculated to these legal challenges is it appears as though they have the co-sponsors have worked very closely with constitutional lawyers to try to get around the concerns that were raised legally the previous times that a ban was initiated. So I think avoiding the banning language, but also if you look at the language in the 2023 proposal versus now, it was much more about American users. And now this is being framed explicitly as a national security threat. And in that intervening time, there have appeared to be many closed door sessions with members of Congress and the intelligence community talking about what these concerns are. So that's a whole separate issue about the closed door aspect of that and what that means democratically.
Don, let me ask you about that vote in the House of Representatives, because it was a landslide, 352 for and 65 against. And this was despite an extensive lobbying campaign by ByteDance. We're told that thousands and thousands of calls and messages to members of Congress. That seems to have backfired. Let me just read this quote from Richie Torres, Democratic congressman for New York. The iron grip that TikTok has on the minds of young people is a profound public health hazard. They felt that this was organised by TikTok, this campaign that they received. Was it, or was it the genuine view of users?
So just a couple things I want to respond to here. One, it's not just about the young people. My mom is on TikTok nonstop, right? It's not just young users. It's also people who are more elderly who are being corrupted by this. But just to go back to a couple points. One, this is just another knee-jerk reaction by our politicians who just aren't capable of actually solving the true problem here. And the true problem is data privacy. And all these other organizations, Facebook, with Meta and all those, all have similar data. They've interfered in elections as well. We know that. That's already been proven. So this legislation isn't going to really amount to anything. Yes, it will get TikTok purchased by another organization, but it's not going to fix the true root cause of the problem, which is lack of governance, lack of data privacy in our country. That's where the focus of our politicians should be. That's where it should have been 3 years ago when I banned it in New York. And this type of knee-jerk reaction we've seen with other things, it's going to end up in court for a while. Eventually, TikTok will get sold. There will be some other Chinese company that pops up doing something similar, and we'll be in this cycle again.
Just to be clear, you didn't ban it in New York. You banned it in New York State on official business phones.
Right.
You did, yeah, because you can still access. To be clear, you can still access TikTok and use TikTok, as I'm sure thousands of people do in New York. Ching, your reaction to the House of Representatives vote and the fact that it was bipartisan and such a large vote, but at the same time, the opponents were also bipartisan. On both sides, there seems to be people who are unlikely bedfellows who are joining together.
I am actually surprised by the landslide victory that Bill has got, and I was excited about it. And like the thing that I've seen is TikTok is trying to make out like as if it is a casualty between the competition between the US and China, which seems to me like some kind of gaslighting, like pre-hour strategies. And they can't expect us to forget the fact that TikTok is being used as a tool to monitor journalists on Financial Times, on BuzzFeed, and so on. And they can't expect me to forget about the manipulation of content on Uyghurs and so on, and LGBTQ, and on the June 4th massacre and so on. But at the same time, I want to like reiterate something on the point about like Facebook, Google, they all collect massive amount of data. That's true. And they are not responsible users. That's true too. But at the same time, like there is some sort of transparency. They can issue transparency report saying that this is how many requests we got from the US government or the Hong Kong government or wherever that is, the data request. But in China, that requirement is not even possible. That they have to de facto lie about it if they're asked to by the Beijing government and by TikTok or ByteDance. At the same time, like Google and Facebook, at least Google had take some governments into court to challenge some of its decisions that make, but this is not possible in China as well. And also like Facebook and Google, how big they are, they're not tied to government, while ByteDance is highly tied to the Chinese Communist Party. So from an activist point of view, I'd say I would be more worried about my data falling into the hands of ByteDance compared to falling into Google or Facebook, because honestly, I'm addicted to social media myself. But still, like the fear is quite different between the two. And I think from my perspective as a Hong Kong activist living in exile, the vote gives me some sort of hope that, oh, maybe we are moving towards the right direction to solve this problem. But the broader data privacy problem still exists. Like, why do these companies have so much data about me that's not necessarily required by the law?
Sarah, the arguments we've been discussing, of course, about data and algorithms and how ByteDance could be perhaps persuaded to help China. But there are other arguments, perhaps, which aren't part of the bill, but there are people saying it's immoral, TikTok's poisoning our kids. Let me read you the quote from the former Vice President Mike Pence. He says, "It's essentially digital fentanyl, a 21st century technological weapon. The app is so potent and addictive." How strong are these moral type arguments?
Well, I think the moral arguments are why you get these strange bedfellows, is that you have kind of coalitions on the right and the left, kind of the moral, the righteous right, and then kind of the human rights left that support this kind of legislation. And what's interesting in terms of opposition, you did have a lot more Democrats in the House that opposed it. So I think it was 50 Democrats opposed it compared to 15 Republicans. But those individuals, and what you see foreshadowed in the Senate, is it's kind of the libertarian, Rand Paul in the Senate. I saw that AOC, a congresswoman from New York, had opposed it in the vote yesterday, and she said that this was brought together. There was in 4 days. There was very little discussion. It was all behind closed door, and I think that's where again you get these interesting. That's what politics is finding a coalition that will support a measure, and that's why you don't get comprehensive data privacy legislation, which so many different people have been pushing for years. You don't get that because there's agreement that there's a problem, but no agreement on what to do. Once you add this China threat, you really can generate, as we saw on Wednesday, you can generate a strong coalition of supporters because of the politics on China.
Don, on that, as you just heard Sarah say, AOC, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, joining forces with the Queen of MAGA, Make America Great, Marjorie Taylor Greene, really unlikely alliances. What's your view on the way this bill was put forward and the speed it was put through at the last stage through the congressional process? Because that seems to have alarmed many, as you just heard Sarah say.
Yeah, and it should alarm everyone. Why are they pushing this through so quickly right now? Is there some other motive that's behind their actions and why they're trying to push this behind closed doors? And they did push it behind closed doors to successfully get it passed. It definitely concerns me. And again, they're attacking this as a China-owned entity, but they're not fixing the true problems. And I think that's going to be my biggest concern. There's ways to allow TikTok to exist, which doesn't include a full ban, right? The data could be stored in the United States. They could have the request that TikTok use anonymization of the data processing so that the data isn't tied specifically to people. There's lots of options that could take place that they're not putting out there. And all of that makes me extremely concerned.
If I can ask you, Ching, about the reaction, well, TikTok's reaction, they have said this is a ban, nothing more or less. And the Chinese reaction, this will seriously damage investors from multiple countries, including China, hurt confidence to invest in the US, and China resolutely opposes it. That's part of the statement from Beijing. What is your reaction to that, given that if you go to China and you try and access large parts of the internet, you can't get it?
Yeah, there's definitely this kind of imbalance or unfair treatment when it comes to online service providers. Like Google has had to leave the market in China, LinkedIn was forced to leave, Facebook was never in, and so on. And at the same time, if you look at the personal information law in China, they basically require any data that Chinese company generates has to be stored locally. So this is the concept that they call data sovereignty. At the same time, in 2016, they have already made the decision that big data is considered as basic strategic resources. That is key for its great rejuvenation, as Xi Jinping puts it, which is his personal legacy and the CCC legacy, which they're trying to achieve. And for them, like having harnessed mass data around the world, it's actually a key thing to them to try to make the country greater or derive strategic reactions towards foreign policy that's being announced by other countries. So I'd say I would have expected these kind of response coming from TikTok and the Chinese government, because they don't only see TikTok as or ByteDance as a business. They see all kinds of businesses, not only ByteDance, but it will apply to all the businesses as some kind of strategic material that the party can use or make use of whenever they find necessary. So we can't use the same kind of free market logic to try to understand businesses that comes from China. And at the same time, that kind of unfair treatment that data can only go into China, but rarely data can go out of China, given the current law and the very restrictive approach that China has been very protective towards its data, not for privacy reasons, only for strategic and international political reasons. And this is quite concerning to the world in a situation. And even with places like European Union with like more advanced data protection law, like this problem still exists. Like data can just transfer into China, but nothing comes out of it. So it's actually very worrying to see. And I don't find the investment argument very attractive coming from China.
OK, let me bring it back to the US, because it's an election year and young people are going to be a key demographic. As we've already heard, Biden says he'll sign this bill, and yet he has a TikTok account for his election campaign. And with regard to Donald Trump on TikTok, he's been a flip-flop. This is what he said in 2020.
We're looking at TikTok. We may be banning TikTok. We may be doing some other things. There are a couple of options, but a lot of things are happening. So we'll see what happens. But we are looking at a lot of alternatives with respect to TikTok.
Now compare that with an interview he gave to a US cable channel, CNBC, earlier this week.
Frankly, there are a lot of people on TikTok that love it. There are a lot of young kids on TikTok who will go crazy without it. There are a lot of users. There's, a lot of good, and there's a lot of bad with TikTok. But the thing I don't like is that without TikTok, you can make Facebook bigger. And I consider Facebook to be an enemy of the people.
Sarah, is this going to become an election issue, do you think, now? Or do you think Biden will want nothing to happen before November?
Well, it seems to be an evolving story. I saw just this morning that Trump's former Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, is putting together a bid to buy TikTok. And that would be really interesting. I don't know if that would go forward. I also think that Trump's language on this shifted a little bit, which is then he said, well, it's actually a really complicated story. And I think, he's someone who's both impulsive and vindictive. And so that could explain that initial response the other day. But it also then, I think, complicated matters because of that. Well, you were for it 4 years ago, now you're against it. You know, one of the interesting aspects of the language that no one has really talked about or haven't seen discussed very much is that it gives the president a lot of authority to determine which entities, which platforms are foreign adversary owned. And so someone like President Trump should love this kind of thing because it would give the president a lot of authority to make those determinations. But I also think that's what makes the language in the current bill quite dangerous, because it hands a lot of power over to the president to make these determinations. And there might be a consensus that in this case, TikTok, there's agreement that that's a hostile foreign adversary owned platform. But what happens now? There's no sunset on this legislation. What happens down the road? We're in peacetime. And so it's very interesting that this kind of almost wartime encroachment on civil liberties is happening during peacetime and opening the door to possible greater infringement.
Don, how do you see the future for TikTok? Do you think we're going to have some sort of fire sale after this bill becomes law, or do you think it's going to be very, very lengthy court action?
Yeah, I think we're going to see a prolonged court case. I don't think we're going to see anything really develop before the election. I don't think there will be any decisions, but I think that right now, if you're going to get rid of TikTok, everyone wants to buy it. So it's, the market top for it. So ByteDance wants to offload it. Definitely now's the time to do it. We know they don't want to upload it, but it's eventually going to happen. So, now's the best time when it comes from them getting the best price for it.
OK, well, thank you to all our guests for joining us today. Sarah Krebs, Don Horan and Chung Kwong. You can always find this channel's TikTok at Al Jazeera English. And if you missed any of this programme, you can always watch it again anytime on the website, aljazeera.com. And if you have further thoughts on this issue and aren't on TikTok, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. We also want to hear from you on X, the former Twitter, at AJ Inside Story. From me, James Bays, and the team here in Doha, please stay safe. I'll be back very soon. Bye for now.